The flickering blue light of the television screen filled our quiet living room, turning the air cold and clinical. Rexton was there, standing in the center of a media circus, looking like a man who had finally run out of shadows to hide in. He was being escorted down the courthouse steps, his expensive suit rumpled and his expression a mask of fading bravado. Theodora's hand found mine, her grip firm and steady, reminding me that we are still the mountain while he is just the weather. It had been 10 years since he slammed our front door, claiming our old-fashioned integrity was a weight he could no longer carry. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing. But for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. Now, it seemed his modern shortcuts had led him straight into a dead end of federal indictments and public disgrace. I watched his eyes on the broadcast. They were darting, searching for an exit that his lawyers clearly couldn't provide. He always underestimated the patience of those who watch from the sidelines, waiting for the inevitable crack in the hull. The news report mentioned a missing ledger, the one piece of evidence that could either bury him or offer a path to redemption. I glanced toward the heavy iron safe in my study, the one Rexton thought I'd emptied years ago when I retired. He was always too busy looking at the horizon to notice what was right beneath his feet. We didn't feel pity or shock. We felt the quiet satisfaction of architects watching a poorly built tower finally succumb to gravity. He thinks he's lost everything, but he has no idea that the real reckoning hasn't even knocked on his door yet. The phone on the sideboard screamed for attention, a persistent electronic bird that didn't know when to shut up. I stared at it like it was a primitive artifact I'd forgotten how to use, though in truth, I just didn't want to acknowledge the name flashing on the screen. Theodora says I treat modern technology like a personal insult, and she's probably right. I still haven't forgiven the microwave for what it does to a decent piece of crusty bread. I reach for the device, my thumb missing the accept button twice because my touch apparently isn't delicate enough for glass screens. A minor domestic failure I prefer to blame on poor engineering. The caller ID was a string of numbers from the very city that had swallowed Rexton whole a decade ago. A place where people trade their souls for a better view of the skyline. He used to tell me that my silence was a weapon, but he never understood it was actually a shield I used to protect him from himself. Now, seeing his face on the news, sweating under the glare of camera lights, I realized he'd finally shattered that shield beyond repair. Theodora moved past me, her silk robe rustling like dry leaves, and she didn't even glance at the ringing phone. She was rearranging the spice rack by memory, a task she performs only when her mind is miles ahead of her hands. Plotting moves 3 steps deep. If that's the telemarketer about the car warranty, Silas, tell them the Buick is already a museum piece and I am the curator, she said without turning around. I didn't laugh, though I felt the ghost of a smile. We both knew the digital tether was pulling from the other side of a very deep grave. The ringing stopped, then started again immediately, more frantic this time. A digital scream for a father he once called obsolete. 10 years of silence cannot be mended by a single desperate signal, and I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of an easy rescue or a soft landing. I let it ring until the voicemail took over, imagining the look of panic on his face when he realized the old man wasn't jumping to attention. You don't survive 7 decades by being the first one to blink, and I have had plenty of practice in the art of the long wait. I looked at the dark TV screen, seeing our reflection, 2 shadows who had built a life on stone, watching the ghost of a son who built his on shifting sand. I heard the heavy crunch of gravel outside, an unfamiliar vehicle slowing down at our gate, and I knew the storm wasn't just on the television screen anymore. The headlights of the sleek, black SUV outside were bright enough to reveal every cobweb on my porch that I had been meaning to clear since the last presidency. I stood up, adjusting my cardigan with a precision that would suggest I was heading to a diplomatic summit rather than a confrontation in my own driveway. I tried to flick the porch light on, but the switch gave me that stubborn resistance it always does when I am in a hurry, forcing me to jiggle it like a safe cracker. A small, domestic failure I refused to admit to Theodora. When the light finally buzzed to life, it illuminated Lavinia, Rexton's wife, looking like she had just stepped out of a high-fashion funeral. She didn't wait for an invitation. She marched toward the door, her heels clicking on the stone path with the rhythm of an impending migraine. 10 years ago, She told Theodora that our house smelled like unfulfilled potential, yet here she was, seeking refuge in our dust. Hollis, thank God you're home, she said, her voice brittle and lacking the warmth of a person who actually cared if I was alive or dead. She pushed past me into the hallway, smelling of expensive lilies and cold desperation, already scanning the room for the comfort she once mocked. I watched her, not moving an inch, allowing the silence to stretch until the air in the foyer felt thick enough to choke on. She started rambling about frozen assets and misunderstandings, as if Rexton's federal fraud was just a clerical error at a local bake sale. I once spent 3 hours trying to program the smart thermostat Rexton gave us, only to end up wearing a winter coat in July. I felt that same sense of a controlled mess about to become a total disaster. I crossed my arms, looking at her with the same detached curiosity I would use on a particularly bold raccoon found in the trash. You seem to have forgotten the way, Lavinia, I said, my voice low and devoid of the hospitality she clearly expected. She stopped mid-sentence, her face turning a shade of pale that matched her pearls, finally realizing that the old folks weren't going to offer her a cup of tea and a shoulder to cry on. The injustice of it was almost poetic. They spent a decade pretending we were ghosts, and now they wanted those ghosts to fight their demons. Behind her, another set of headlights appeared at the end of the drive, slower and far more menacing, casting a long shadow that didn't belong to a luxury SUV. This wasn't a family reunion. It was a hunt, and the predators were finally closing in on our front gate. Lavinia was pacing my hardwood floors like a caged panther in a designer dress, her frantic energy clashing with the quiet dignity of our family portraits. I decided to ignore her hysterics for a moment and focused on the kitchen window, which had developed a stubborn streak of refusing to latch properly in the damp evening air. I struggled with the wooden frame, my knuckles white as I applied a calibrated amount of force that resulted in a sharp crack and the window finally seating. A small victory over inanimate objects that usually leaves me feeling like a triumphant gladiator, even if I momentarily forgot which way the latch actually turned. Theodora entered the room, carrying a tray of tea with a grace that made Lavinia's trembling hands look amateurish, though I noticed she'd brought the guest cups, the chipped ones we keep for people we don't particularly like. Lavinia didn't even notice. She was too busy checking her reflection in the dark glass of the oven, her face a mask of calculated grief that didn't quite reach her eyes. Hollis, the feds are going to freeze everything, including the trust funds for the children, she hissed, as if I should be moved by the plight of bank accounts I'd never been allowed to see. I took a slow sip of my tea, savoring the bitter notes, and looked her dead in the eye, realizing she still thought money was the only currency that mattered in this house. 10 years ago, she laughed when I told her that a man's name is his only true inheritance. Now, she was discovering that Rexton's name was worth less than the lint in my pocket. My silence was beginning to unnerve her, which was entirely the point, because a man who doesn't speak is a man you can't predict. Outside, the second car's door slammed with a heavy, expensive thud, and a man in a charcoal suit, Warwick, Rexton's lead counsel, stepped into the porch light. He adjusted his silk tie with the confidence of a man who believes everyone has a price, clearly unaware that I stopped selling out before he was even born. I watched him approach through the glass, his smile as fake as a $3 bill, and I felt a cold, familiar spark of predatory focus ignite in my chest. If they thought they could use our home as a bunker for their scandals, they were about to learn that this relic still had plenty of teeth. Warwick didn't come here to ask for our help. He came because he believes Rexton hid the missing ledger in the one place the FBI wouldn't dare to look, under my floorboards. Warwick stepped into the foyer with the practiced air of a man who owned the air he breathed, his gaze sweeping over our home with a condescending pity. I met him at the threshold, my hands tucked deep into my pockets to hide the fact that I had accidentally smeared a bit of strawberry jam on my thumb during a late-night snack, a tactical error that would have ruined my intimidating patriarch look if he'd noticed. He didn't offer a hand, which was wise, as I was in no mood to play the game of firm handshakes and empty pleasantries. Instead, his eyes lingered on our 1970s wallpaper as if it were a crime scene, while I leaned against the doorframe, purposely choosing the one spot that always lets out a low, mournful groan when weighted. Theodora appeared behind him like a ghost, her presence so silent and heavy that Warwick jumped slightly when she offered him a napkin for the beads of sweat on his brow. I watched him try to regain his footing, his expensive briefcase clicking open with a sharp sound that felt far too aggressive for our quiet hallway. He started talking about non-disclosure agreements and inherited loyalty, phrases that meant absolutely nothing to a man who had spent 40 years building a reputation on a handshake. I found myself thinking about the time I tried to fix the grandfather clock and ended up with 3 extra springs and a chime that sounded like a dying duck. Rexton's legal defense felt exactly like that. A bunch of broken parts masquerading as a machine. "I'm not interested in your loyalty, counselor," I said, letting the words hang in the air until the silence became a physical weight. "I'm interested in why my son thinks his father's house is a dumping ground for his failures." Warwick leaned in closer, dropping the professional mask to reveal the predator underneath, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room for any sign of the ledger. He mentioned that Rexton had insinuated I was holding on to a certain package that belonged to the firm, his tone shifting from persuasive to subtly threatening. I didn't blink, even when my left foot started to fall asleep. A minor physical annoyance I simply willed out of existence through sheer, stubborn focus. We stood there, 2 men from different worlds, while the clock in the hall ticked away the final seconds of my son's remaining freedom. He thought he was the one holding the cards, but he hadn't realized yet that I had replaced the entire deck years before he ever sat at the table. Warwick shifted his weight, his Italian leather shoes squeaking on the rug like a trapped mouse. I reached for my reading glasses to examine the urgent document he'd slid onto the table, but my pocket was empty, reminding me I'd likely left them in the refrigerator again while searching for the mustard, a lapse I decided to treat as a deep, meditative pause rather than a senior moment. He thought he could intimidate me with legal jargon, speaking in circles about contingent liabilities as if I hadn't spent half a century reading between the lines of much more dangerous men. I stood my ground, my posture as rigid as the old oak beam in the cellar, watching him sweat through his $1,000 shirt while I enjoyed the cool draft from the hallway. Suddenly, the smart speaker Rexton had gifted us, a device I usually use as a very expensive paperweight, woke up and chirped. I didn't quite catch that, breaking the tension with its robotic cheerfulness. I didn't even look at it. I kept my eyes on Warwick, letting him wonder if I had the house bugged or if I was just that much better at the game than he was. "My son didn't send you here to protect me, counselor," I said, my voice cutting through the artificial silence like a cold blade. "He sent you to see if the old lion still has enough teeth to tear his carefully crafted story apart." The realization hit him then, the slow, creeping horror that I wasn't the target of his interrogation, but the judge of his performance. I remembered Rexton as a boy, how he used to hide his broken toys in the back of the closet, thinking that if he couldn't see the mess, it didn't exist. He'd grown up, but he was still just hiding broken things in our closets, hoping we wouldn't notice the smell of rot coming from the walls. Warwick tried to speak, but I raised one hand, a simple gesture that silenced him more effectively than any gavel ever could. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was the gatekeeper to the one truth Rexton had spent a decade trying to bury under piles of digital currency. Every second he spent in my house was a second he was losing ground, and he knew it, his confidence crumbling like dry toast under my steady gaze. Theodora walked back into the room, her eyes meeting mine with a shared understanding that needed no words. The trap was set, and the prey had walked right into the middle of it. We are not a rescue party, and we are certainly not an insurance policy for a man who traded his soul for a seat at a table that was never meant for him. A heavy knock thundered against the back door, not the front where the lawyers wait, but the back, where the people who don't care about laws usually enter. The back door didn't just rattle. It thudded with a heavy, rhythmic authority that belonged to someone who didn't believe in doorbells or invitations. I didn't rush. Instead, I took a deliberate moment to fix a crooked magnet on the refrigerator, a tiny ceramic owl Theodora loves, which I usually manage to knock sideways every time I reach for the milk. My hand was steady, even as Warwick's face drained of color, his expensive legal mind clearly racing to figure out which of Rexton's associates had found us first. I walked toward the mudroom, momentarily losing my grip on the door handle because I'd overoiled the hinges last Saturday. A minor domestic overkill that left the knob feeling like a bar of wet soap. I played it off as a strategic pause, wiping my hand on my trousers with a slow, calculated grace that seemed to unnerve the man standing on the other side of the glass. It was Vance, a man who dressed like a banker but carried the cold, predatory stillness of a professional cleaner. He didn't wait for me to speak. He just looked past me into the kitchen, his eyes scanning for the iron safe he assumed was the graveyard of Rexton's secrets. "Hollis," he said, his voice a low, gravelly threat. "The boy said you were the one holding the anchor while the ship went down." I leaned against the doorframe, realizing Rexton hadn't just run to us for help, illegally or otherwise. He had actively tried to point the wolves toward our doorstep to save his own skin. It was a pathetic move, the kind of desperate gamble a man makes when he forgets that the person who raised him knows all his tells. I felt a surge of cold, dry anger, not because I was afraid, but because my son had finally committed the one sin I couldn't ignore. He had mistaken my silence for a lack of weapons. I looked at Vance, then at the trembling Warwick, seeing two men who thought they were the smartest people in a room full of relics. They had no idea that I'd been documenting Rexton's every shortcut for 10 years, not out of malice, but out of a father's grim necessity to know exactly where the rot started. Theodora stepped up beside me, her presence a silent, sharp blade that cut through the tension, and I knew my time for talking was over. Vance reached for the inner pocket of his coat, a movement too fast for a polite conversation, and I realized he wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to make sure the relics didn't live to testify.
I watched Hollis wipe his hand on his trousers, a futile attempt to hide the strawberry jam he'd smeared on the doorknob earlier, a small domestic blunder I chose to ignore for the sake of his dignity. Men like Vance think they are the only ones who can command a room, but they forget that I've spent 40 years orchestrating the silence in this house. As Vance reached into his coat, my heart didn't race. It slowed down, finding that cold, rhythmic clarity that usually only comes when I'm threading a needle in bad light. I noticed a stray thread on my cardigan and resisted the urge to pull it, knowing that once you start unraveling things, you never know where the loose ends will lead you. Lavinia was still hovering near the toaster, her face a mask of designer grief, likely wondering if the federal agents would seize her collection of Italian leather boots. It is a peculiar thing to watch your daughter-in-law treat a federal investigation like a social inconvenience, but she was always better at accessorizing than thinking. I turned the kettle off with a sharp, final click, the sudden silence in the kitchen acting like a physical weight that pressed against the intruders' chests. Rexton was our son, yes, but he was also a man who had clearly forgotten the steel that runs through the bones of the woman who carried him. He thought we were the weak links in his chain, the easy targets he could sacrifice to the wolves to buy himself another night of borrowed luxury. Vance didn't pull a weapon, but a document, a heavy, legal-sized envelope that smelled of fresh ink and old betrayals. He laid it on the counter with a smirk, thinking he had us cornered, unaware that I had already read the digital trail Rexton left behind months ago. I picked up my knitting, the steel needles clicking together with a sound that mirrored the ticking of the clock, a countdown they weren't smart enough to hear. "You've come a long way to show us a piece of paper that carries no weight in this house," I said, my voice as smooth as polished marble and just as cold. Warwick tried to interrupt, but one look from me silenced him, a look I usually reserve for the butcher when he tries to tell me a subpar cut of beef is prime. We are not the victims of this story. We are the authors of its final chapter, and I was just getting started with the editing. I looked at the envelope, knowing that inside wasn't just a threat, but the evidence of a betrayal that went far deeper than even Hollis suspected. Vance sat there with the smug grin of a man who thinks he's holding the leash, completely unaware that he's in the presence of the one who built the kennel. I watched Hollis out of the corner of my eye. He was trying to look menacing while subtly wrestling with a child-proof latch Rexton had installed on the liquor cabinet 3 years ago. It was a humiliating spectacle of modern plastic versus old-world stubbornness, but Hollis didn't break his stare with Vance even as the cabinet door gave a sharp, indignant squeak. I slid the documents from the envelope, my eyes scanning the lines with the speed of a woman who has spent decades proofreading the fine print of life. Rexton hadn't just used our address. The coward had used our names, layering his digital filth over the clean legacy we'd spent 40 years polishing. He had forged Hollis's signature on a series of offshore transfers, thinking his father's steady hand was something he could mimic with a stylus and a screen. Warwick shifted in his seat, the smell of his expensive cologne now souring with the stench of a man who realized he was trapped in a room with two people who had nothing left to lose. "You think this makes us your partners, Mr. Vance?" I asked, my voice as dry as a desert wind that has forgotten the taste of rain. I looked at the signatures, clumsy, hollow imitations that lacked the weight of a man who had actually lived through the consequences of his choices. A person who hasn't felt the sting of a hard winter thinks they can just paint over the frost and call it spring, but the ice always finds the cracks. I set the papers down and smoothed them with my palm, a gesture of finality that seemed to pull the oxygen right out of the room. Lavinia let out a small, pathetic whimper by the sink, a sound that reminded me of a bird that had flown into a window and was surprised to find the glass was solid. I didn't pity her. I was too busy calculating the exact temperature at which Rexton's world would finally begin to melt. "We aren't your accomplices," I whispered, leaning forward until Vance was forced to lean back. "We are the evidence you didn't account for, and I assure you, my memory is far more permanent than any server you can wipe." Hollis finally won the battle with the cabinet, the door swinging open with a thud that echoed like a gunshot in the silent kitchen. He pulled out 2 glasses, not for our guests, but for us, because we were going to need a clear head to watch the coming fire. As I reached for my glass, I noticed a small, red light blinking from the decorative wreath on the wall. Someone else had been listening to every word we said since the moment they arrived. The blinking red light was nestled deep in the artificial pine needles of the Christmas wreath I'd refused to take down since January. Hollis had tried to disable the wreath's musical sensor last year, but instead of silence, he managed to make it emit a low, judgmental click every time the door opened, a household repair failure that was finally proving its worth as a warning system. I didn't point out the camera immediately. I simply watched Vance's eyes flicker toward it, his smugness replaced by a sharp, jagged edge of realization that he wasn't the only one recording this encounter. He thought he was the one wiretapping the old folks, but he'd forgotten that in this house, even the furniture has spent decades learning how to keep its mouth shut until invited to speak. Rexton always said I was too sentimental about keeping these dust collectors, yet here he was, using a cheap surveillance bug hidden in a holiday decoration to spy on the mother who taught him how to read. I took a slow sip of the brandy Hollis had finally liberated from the cabinet, the liquid warmth grounding me while the atmosphere in the room turned arctic. "Is that your insurance policy, Mr. Vance, or is your memory simply failing you at such a young age?" I asked, my voice cutting through his bravado like a winter frost. Warwick looked like he wanted to dissolve into the upholstery, his legal mind finally grasping that they weren't the ones conducting the interrogation anymore. Lavinia gasped, a sharp, theatrical sound that I've learned to ignore over the years, much like the way I ignore the rattling of the radiator in the guest room. She reached for her phone, but I placed my hand over hers, a gesture that was gentle in appearance, but carried the absolute weight of a closing bolt. I remembered Rexton's first business venture, a lemonade stand where he watered down the juice and overcharged the neighbors, and realized he'd never actually grown up. He'd just found bigger pitchers to pour from. The injustice of him using our reputations as collateral for his greed wasn't a wound that would bleed. It was a fire that was beginning to consume the very bridge he hoped to crawl back on. We weren't just the relics in the suburbs anymore. We were the only ones holding the physical keys to the digital kingdom he'd built on lies. I looked directly into the hidden lens in the wreath, a cold smile touching my lips as I prepared to reveal the one secret that would render their documents completely worthless. The shadow across the porch shifted, and for the first time tonight, Vance looked truly terrified of what was waiting in the darkness of our garden. Vance's eyes remained glued to the garden, his hand twitching near his waistband, a nervous habit of men who think they can solve every problem with a piece of steel. I watched Hollis step toward the sliding glass door, brandishing an old heavy-duty flashlight that looked more like a club than a light source. He gave it a sharp, authoritative smack against his palm to wake the batteries, but instead of a beam, it let out a pathetic, dying yellow glow that barely illuminated his own shoes. A small equipment failure that didn't stop him from looking like a man about to go to war. He didn't curse. He simply tucked the useless thing under his arm and used the reflection in the glass to monitor the room behind him, proving that experience is worth more than a working bolt. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice cutting through the humid tension of the kitchen, "the shadow you see in the yard isn't the police. It's the consequence of believing we were too old to maintain our own security. 10 years ago, Rexton tried to tell us that privacy was a traditional luxury we couldn't afford, yet here he was, desperate for the very sanctuary he'd spent a decade mocking." The documents on the table were a pathetic attempt to bind us to his crimes, but they forgot that a forged signature on a digital screen doesn't mean a thing to people who still value the weight of a physical deed. I noticed Warwick's knees were actually shaking now, the rhythmic thumping against the table legs sounding like a distant drum roll for a funeral. It's a curious thing to see men in tailored suits realize that their authority ends at the property line of people who don't care about their titles or their threats. I took another sip of my drink, the ice clinking against the glass with a sharp, final sound that made Vance jump as if he'd heard a hammer being cocked. I remember when Rexton was 10 and he tried to hide a stray dog in the basement. He always thought he could smuggle his problems into this house and make them ours. But this isn't a basement for strays anymore, and we are not the soft-hearted parents who will clean up the mess just because his name is on our birth records. I leaned back, my eyes never leaving Vance's face, watching the sweat trail down his temple while the silence from the garden grew heavier and more deliberate. The irony of him being trapped in a house he thought he was invading was a flavor more satisfying than the finest wine in our cellar. He reached for his phone, but the signal bar on his screen plummeted to 0, another old-fashioned trick Hollis had installed during his weekend hobby with signal dampeners. The shadow in the garden finally moved into the light, and it wasn't a stranger at all, but a face from the television news that had somehow escaped the cameras and found its way to our back door. Rexton stood there, hair matted by the rain, looking less like a titan of industry and more like a soggy apprentice who'd lost his way in the woods. Hollis tried to slide the glass door open with the dramatic flourish of a man defending his castle, but the track caught on a stray pebble, likely one I'd told him to sweep up since the spring thaw. Causing him to lurch forward with a sharp grunt he tried very hard to pass off as a tactical lunge. I didn't move from my chair, my knitting needles still clicking a steady, mocking rhythm that seemed to keep time with Rexton's frantic breathing. Our son didn't look at us with love or even regret. His eyes were darting toward the study where the safe sat, proving that after 10 years of disrupting the market, he was still just a child looking to steal his father's peace. "I need the ledger, Mother," he rasped, his voice lacking the polished resonance he used on the morning talk shows to lie to millions. It was almost comical to see him so diminished, standing in his bespoke shoes on a mud-caked porch, begging for a salvation he'd spent a decade insisting was obsolete. Hollis regained his footing, adjusting his cardigan with a dignity that made Rexton's panic look amateurish, and stepped between our son and the hallway. "You left this house saying we were the weight that held you back," Hollis said, his voice as immovable as the mountain itself. "You don't get to ask the anchor to save you when you've already cut the rope." Vance moved toward the center of the room, his hand reaching for the document again, and I realized Rexton hadn't just come home. He had brought the very wolves he'd fed with our name. The threat wasn't just about the money anymore. It was the realization that our son was willing to let us take the fall for his forgeries just to buy himself one more night of luxury. I felt a cold, sharp clarity, the kind you get when you realize the person you raised has become the very predator you must now put down to protect your pride. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood with a sound like a closing vault, and looked Rexton in the eye until his gaze finally broke. He was a man who had built a skyscraper on a foundation of lies, and I was about to show him exactly what happens when the architect decides to pull the plans. Rexton's hand froze on the door frame as the low, rhythmic thumping of a helicopter began to vibrate the window panes, but the light wasn't searching the woods, it was centered directly on our roof. The helicopter's spotlight turned our backyard into a blinding theatrical stage, catching Rexton in its glare as he squinted like a cornered animal suddenly exposed to the sun. Hollis, ever the man of action, tried to draw the heavy velvet curtains to reclaim our privacy, but he caught his sleeve on the ornate rod, resulting in a brief, silent struggle that looked more like a strange interpretive dance than a tactical maneuver. He recovered with a dry, sharp cough, smoothing his cardigan and looking at Rexton as if the boy were a stubborn smudge on the carpet we had finally decided to scrub away. "You brought the whole world to my garden, Rexton," I said, my voice rising just enough to be heard over the rhythmic, bone-shaking thrum of the blades above us. He looked at me, truly seeing me for the first time in a decade, and I saw the hollow fear of a man who realized his parents were no longer his safety net, but his jury. Vance and Warwick were already backing away from the windows, their bravado evaporating like mist in a gale as they realized that being found in this house was the final nail in their professional coffins. I walked to the safe, the one Rexton thought contained the evidence of his father's crimes, and dialed the combination with fingers that were as cold and steady as ice. It is a funny thing about memory. I can never remember where I put my spare keys, but I will never forget the numbers that protect our family's truth. The door of the safe swung open with a heavy, oiled sigh, revealing not a ledger of illegal transfers, but a stack of handwritten journals dating back to the day our son first slammed that front door. Rexton lunged forward, his face twisted with a desperate, pathetic greed, thinking he could still snatch his future back from the hands that once cradled him. Hollis didn't even have to break a sweat. He simply extended his leg at the perfect moment, and Rexton, in his frantic rush, tripped over his father's sturdy shoe and landed face first on the rug he once called peasant decor. "The ledger isn't a weapon for you to use, son," I whispered, looking down at him as the first heavy boots of the federal team thudded onto the porch. These books were a record of every lie he'd sent our way, every dollar he'd tried to ghost through our accounts, meticulously documented for this exact moment of inevitable reckoning. The injustice of his betrayal wasn't going to be mended with an apology. It was being finalized by the cold, hard facts of a mother who never stopped paying attention. The front door burst open as the federal agents flooded the hallway, but my eyes weren't on their badges. They were on the small, silver flash drive I had kept hidden in my knitting basket. Rexton was about to find out that the journals were just the prologue, and the real story was about to be uploaded to every major news outlet in the country. The kitchen was suddenly a sea of tactical gear and shouting, but I stayed seated, the silver flash drive cool and heavy in my palm like a smooth river stone. Hollis stood by the pantry, still clutching a bag of flour he'd instinctively grabbed when the door burst open, a minor domestic reflex he quickly masked by placing it on the counter with the solemnity of a judge delivering a sentence. He watched the agents pin Rexton to the floor with the same detached interest he uses when watching a neighbor fail to park a boat against a strong tide. Rexton was screaming about rights and due process, his voice cracking as the cold steel of the handcuffs finally snapped shut around his manicured wrists. I didn't look at the chaos. I looked at Lavinia, who was fruitlessly trying to convince a stern-faced officer that her designer handbag was essential personal property and not a potential vessel for smuggled assets. It is a tragedy when a child mistakes their parents' restraint for a lack of resources, and a catastrophe when they forget that we were the ones who taught them how to navigate the world. I handed the silver drive to the lead agent, a man whose exhaustion matched my own, and told him it contained the decrypted backups of the servers Rexton thought he had wiped. Our son's face went from a frantic red to a ghostly white, the realization finally hitting him that the relics hadn't just been hoarding memories, but building a digital fortress he couldn't even perceive. We didn't need a high-priced legal team or a PR firm. We had 40 years of living within the lines and the quiet, unshakable power of a clean conscience. As they led him toward the door, Rexton looked back at Hollis, searching for a spark of paternal pity that simply wasn't there to be found anymore. Hollis merely adjusted his glasses and pointed to a fresh scuff Mark Rexton's shoe had left on the hardwood, a dry observation that pierced the son's ego more than any lecture could. The house grew quiet again as the helicopter's roar faded into the distance, leaving only the scent of cold night air and the steady, reassuring tick of the grandfather clock. We aren't broken, and we certainly aren't confused. We are simply the last people standing when the dust of 1,000 lies finally settles. I picked up my knitting again, the rhythmic click of the needles the only sound in a house that was finally, truly clean. We lost a son 10 years ago, but today, we finally took back our name, and that is a trade I would make every single time.